This session is going to specifically cover the use of Luma Ranges for landscape photography. Of course you can use a Luma Range in other genres of photography, but the reality is for me, the Luma Range was a game changer when it got introduced into Capture One, because it meant that all the other methods that I previously used to mask an exposure difference and gap were effectively gone in the wind, because this thing pretty much did 90% of cases out of the box. So the Luma Range is a really powerful tool when it comes to a scene that is unbalanced. And by unbalanced, we mean we've got massively exposed highlights and massively underexposed shadows. Let me just correct the exposure back to what we shot. So in here we can see we've got some shadow detail that we want to pull up in the foreground. And we've got a sky that in some places is slightly overexposed, but in the rest of it, it's certainly bright, and it's probably too bright to match what's down here. Now this scene is in Zion National Park. It's at sunrise. This is what my phone camera saw, so this is an iPhone image. Now what the iPhone did at the time was it looked at the scene in front of it and said, it's really dark in the foreground, really bright in the sky. I'm going to automatically switch to HDR mode. So HDR mode allows the camera to then take two exposures, one for the highlights, one for the shadows, combine the two together, and all of a sudden you get what it considers to be a perfectly exposed and composed image, or composited image. The problem with HDR images is they tend to look very cartoony, and in this case you can see it specifically. It just doesn't look real. It's lost all the contrast, and the reason it's lost the contrast is it's blended the shadows from the overexposed image with the highlights from the underexposed image, so everything just sits in this middle part of the histogram here. We're used to a lot more contrast in our images, especially when it's something like a rock and a landscape against the sky. So let's go back to our image here. This is the raw file that came out of the Phase 1 camera. And in here, we actually have a graduated filter in use in front of the lens. You can see in this shot here. So we actually had an ND8 or a 3-stop filter just to get the water to blur here. And we also had a GND, a graduated neutral density, running across the top of the frame. So it was darker at the top in the filter, and then the filter slowly softened out to no effect down at the bottom. But even that wasn't enough, and there's two issues with that filter, especially a flat gradient. The first is the gradient will fall off as it gets nearer and nearer to the bottom of the filter. Well, that's fine, but the brightest part of the image is actually here in the middle. So even though we've darkened the top, it's down here I also want to affect, and that filter's not going to help me with it. The second thing is, where we said it was darker at the top, yes it is, and it's affected the sky, and it's made the sky a little bit darker too. But it's also made these shadows in the mountains darker, and that's not what we want. They were already dark. We don't want them darker still. So these flat graduated filters don't help us here. You might find on the market a couple of random V-shape filters, and we'll cover that in a second, but a V-shape filter is great as long as the shape of the V matches exactly the landscape that you're shooting. If it doesn't, we'll show you in a second, but it's kind of pointless, and it's going to cause you more trouble than good. So let's just start, before we go anywhere else, in making sure that we can get back the detail we want. So in Capture One, let's just pull up our exposure on the background and make sure that in our shadows we have all the detail we want, and we do. It's nice and sharp, it's relatively noise free, it's just a little bit underexposed, and that's what we want to fix. Likewise in the sky, if I pull the exposure down, well, those bits that look like they were overexposed, actually they're pretty good. We've got some lovely cloud texture and some color, so that's pretty good. So we have all the data that we want. The camera has captured all the data we want. We've just got to split out the bright areas from the dark. And this is where a Luma Range comes in. Now before we go into the Luma Range itself, let's just look at the other options. The first option is old school. Let's just draw a mask. So I'm going to turn our standard mask on. I'm going to put a reasonable hardness on the brush. And I'm going to draw, and in fact, just to prove the point, I'm going to draw roughly a V. So let's imagine we've invested in one of these V-shaped filters with a nice soft edge. Now, to turn our mask on, you press the M button on your keyboard, M for mask. To turn it off, you press the M button on your keyboard, M for mask again. Now in this case, I've drawn around where I want, and I'm going to right click on the adjustment layer and say fill that mask, and it's going to fill it with 100%. Now I'm going to use the the grayscale mask tool, which is Option and M, and that shows me the actual mask I drew without the picture behind. So let's press M again to go back to our normal mask. And you could see, if we were that's kind of like a V-shaped mask, all good. So with that mask, let's just pull up with our background, some exposure. And with our adjustment layer that we've just drawn, let's pull that exposure down. That's good. So we've now got a sky that looks about right, and we've got lots of detail here in the foreground. But look at what else it's done. Anywhere that that mask overlapped, in the same way that anywhere a filter would overlap, we've also darkened the shadows as well as the highlights. Because the mask doesn't discriminate between the highlights and the shadows, it's just following a shape. So what I'd then have to do effectively is go in with our eraser, and we would maybe erase some of this stuff. And maybe if I had about 4 days on my hands of free time, I might want to go into this mountain and erase every single little pixel one by one to make sure our mask matched the mountain tops. That's not going to happen. I don't think any sane person would want to do that. But that used to be one of the only tools that we had available to us to fix this problem. So a new version of that brush came along, and it was actually very, very good. So it's called the Auto Mask. So with our mask enabled, when you click on Auto Mask, you get an extra ring on the brush. So just to explain, the inner ring of the brush is going to be placed over the areas that I want to be masked. The middle ring, the central ring, so you've got 3 rings, so ring number 1, the inner one, is the area that we want to cover. The central ring, or ring number 2, is going to be overlapping on the areas that I want the auto mask to discount. In other words, don't include in the mask, and to do some calculations for me. The outer ring you can almost ignore, because the outer ring actually relates to the hardness of the mask. Oh, sorry, the brush. If you have your brush set to 100% hardness, you won't see an outer ring. If you have it set to 0% hardness, you'll see quite a wide outer ring. In this case, the hardness doesn't really matter in auto masking, so I can set it to whatever we want, and we can kind of ignore the outer one. So let's start drawing. Now up here on the sky, I'm going to make sure our central ring is on the sky, and I'm going to make sure that our middle ring, or the ring number 2, is on the mountains. With auto masking, we've got to wait a little bit of time for Capture One to keep up. But what we're going to do, I'm just holding my mouse button down and just drawing the mask as I believe it needs to cut out. Up here and up here. It might have helped if I'd turned the mask on. So there's our mask. It's now going to calculate the auto mask that I drew. And we're going to see in these little edges, once it's done that calculation, that it's done a pretty good job. It's cut out around the mountains, and that's pretty good. I can again right click on this mask and say fill it, and it's going to fill that scene with my auto mask. So my auto mask, let's look at the trees up here. It's done a pretty good job in broad terms. It's cut out around the trees, but still it's not quite right. So we've got some trees that are included in the mask and they shouldn't be. We've also got this area of ambiguity down here because it's not sure really whether or not it should be affected. And we've got these areas here that bleed onto the cliffs. So the amount of cleanup time, again, is pretty extensive, but it's still going to give us a better effect. So if I go back to our background, we've still got our exposure up. On this adjustment layer, we can now pull our exposure down. And it's going to do a pretty good job of balancing out that scene, certainly better than with the brush. But if we look closely, you see all these artifacts here. Now, of course, we can refine the mask, we can feather it. So if we put some feathering on, we can get rid of some of this. Let's just turn the display mask on so you can see. So we can get rid of some of that by effectively adding, unfortunately, a bit of a halo around the edges. So we can apply that. We could also refine that mask. Let's display that as well. And Capture One's going to do some really clever stuff to try and make the mask more realistic. And actually, it does a good job overall. Let's just have a look without the mask on. So that's a pretty good job. It's certainly better than where we started. And it's done a good job of balancing. Now we've got a couple of issues here. We've got some mask stuff that shouldn't be masked. So we then go in and erase this here. So we've still got some tidying up to do. But it's a lot less tidying up than we would have had before. So that was effectively our next go-to. Of course, we could add a new gradient mask, and that's going to be exactly the same as what we would have had before as a lens filter. So if I put that down there, you'll see what I mean in a second. So when I turn that exposure down, absolutely it affects the sky, but it affects it in the wrong way. We've got the darkest part here, lightest part there, and we've darkened our foreground, so that's not good either. So this is where Luma Range comes in. I could do a Luma Range very quickly by drawing, or I could start with even a radial mask or a gradient mask if I wanted to. Let's start with a radial mask, just for fun. So I'm going to draw a radial mask. I'm actually just going to invert that mask. So my radial mask here, I want to affect as much as I can of the valley. So I'm almost using the corners of this round gradient as a way of trying to get a V shape, or the bottom part of a V shape in our mask. That's good. Now I want to just make sure our line is quite hard, because I don't particularly want to take in extra bits of the scene that I didn't mean to. I'm just going to make the mask a little bit wider as well. So that looks pretty good. So that's covering certainly the area we want with some overlap. No problem. So I'm going to turn our mask off. Now, just like before, if I had just reduced our exposure with that mask, yes, we correct the sky. And in fact, we can even be even more clever. We can actually warm up the sky a little bit and boost a little bit of the tint and the Kelvin just to bring it up more to sunrise. But again, we've got these mountains included in the mask. So I could rasterize that mask, and I could use the eraser tool just to erase the mask around the mountains, but I'm back to where I was before. Instead, in Capture One, we now have Luma Range. So I'm going to tick the box to say display the mask. And the Luma Range shows me on here the area which is included in the range that we're selecting. And that includes a little fall off here. So effectively we're ramping up, so don't affect anything that's completely dark, completely black. And then when you get to about 20 on our histogram, everything is included. And everything is included all the way until you get to 235 on the histogram, and then slowly ramp down to white. Now I want everything that's going to be bright, so there's no point in ramping down. So I'm going to pull this up, and you see what happened to the cloud. So everything that was over 211 here wasn't included in the mask. I can do this thing called fall off, which has a softening effect on the mask. But actually there's no point. I want anything that's bright, 100% included in the mask. So we just put this edge of it here with no fall off, 100% of the mask to be applied for anything that's 255 and below. And now we're going to use the lower range to determine where we want the mask to stop on the shadows. So I know that we don't want to include all of the shadows, because I know we want some of these mountains gone. So I can pull our range and watch what happens to the mountains as I do it. We actually watch the mask creep up the mountainside. And up to there. We could go a little bit further. We can probably get away with that there. And we're going to have a soft fall off. So that fall off, remember, is how slowly, effectively, the mask disappears off based on the value of the exposure. So let's just pull that down to about there. That looks pretty good. So what our Luma Range has done is it's taken the original round mask, the gradient of the radial mask that I drew, and it's added a conditional logic on top of it that says, yes, it's very good that you've drawn this lovely radial mask, but I only want to include anything which is 255 on our histogram down to 157, which is our range, but then slowly fall off to the 120 mark on our histogram, which is roughly the midpoint. So that's then selected just this area here. If I apply that, we can see now that if I were, well, in fact, we've already got it programmed in, we've got our exposure in. But by doing that exposure change, the same exposure change, if I look up here at the trees, it's got it pretty right, but we've got these artifacts up here as well, just like we did with the auto mask. But Luma Range has another trick up its sleeve. Instead of using the standard red mask, I'm actually going to switch to our lovely grayscale mask, so Option and M. And we can see why we might have those hard lines and artifacts around the trees. It's because the Luma Range mask has actually created quite a hard line around it all. We've got the function in here to be able to fix that, which is radius. So as I pull radius up, it's a bit like feathering, and we're going to see these lines start to blur. And we can also play with our sensitivity a little bit. So as we blur those lines and apply, let me turn off the grayscale mask, we'll see that those artifacts have now disappeared. So while there may be a few, it's just processing there may be a few still in there we might want to play with. So we've always got the option on our Luma Range, again, to increase the radius. The higher the radius, the softer the transition between the area that is masked and the area that isn't masked. And it also allows us to effectively pull down the darkness a little bit and that fall off. So if I apply that, we've now got an area of bright sky that we can independently control against the rest of the image. So if I go to our background layer and pull up our exposure here, now equally we can still, on the same adjustment layer, we can equally play with our high dynamic range tools. So we can pull down our highlights, we can pull down our whites, and on the background we could still, if we wanted to, pull up our shadows a touch. We could leave our blacks where they were because I want to keep some contrast in there. I could put some overall clarity on the image, and in fact we could even increase a little bit of saturation on the whole picture as well. But that adjustment layer, the difference it's making and the speed and accuracy that it's had over these edges of these mountains, which you saw before were really, really difficult for Capture One to work out, are quite phenomenal. Now that's at 200%, that's at 100% here. The more and more tweaking you do with the Luma Range, so if we play with this radius and play with the fall off, you can get to a much neater and cleaner result over these ridge lines. Remember as well, you also have halo suppression in Capture One, so we can also fix some of the halos that are around the sharpening areas of the scene. But it's the Luma Range that's so powerful when it comes to managing the difference in exposure between sky and ground when you weren't able to do it in the camera. Just like with any other mask, and I just spotted a bit out here, so if I turn our mask on, in fact let's go back to grayscale, you'll see we did pick up some of this mountain here, and the reason is because this Luma Range of that mountain was included in this selection here. The problem is, if I try and discount some of this stuff, we might be discounting some of the clouds. So instead, just like with any other mask, I can rasterize it and I can erase. So if I press E for the eraser button and click, it's going to first warn me and say, do you want to rasterize the mask? The second I do, I'm going to lose the ability to change my radial mask, but I'm not going to lose the ability to change my Luma Range. So be aware that the rasterization warning is only about calculated masks. So in other words, the gradient filter or the gradient mask and the radial mask. It is not about the Luma Range. You can apply Luma Ranges to any calculated mask and any drawn mask with no issue. So I'm going to rasterize my circular or radial mask, and now I can tidy up this area here. Now here's a cool bit. I can even use the auto mask function on our eraser. So I can, with our eraser, say, let's overlap the sky. I'm going to draw the mask over the mountain that I do want to erase, let go, and it's going to calculate the auto mask. And for tidying up, it's going to give me my sky back, hopefully. There we go, and not the ground. And the same on this area here, so let's just overlap the sky and not the rock. And we'll just cover all of that there. Let it calculate, there we go. So I'll turn my mask off. We now have a mask that is completely lined up to the mountain scene. Is still customizable. I can still go to my Luma Range and I can still make changes to that mask. So if I wanted it from 147 up to 197 to maybe exclude some of these clouds up here, I could. I can increase the mask, the Luma Range on the mask if I wanted to. But the Luma Range is completely separate from the mask that I've drawn. So the mask that I've drawn, I can erase specific things. The Luma Range, I can include or exclude certain ranges of brightness and, well, effectively highlights and shadows from the mask that I've drawn. And with that mask applied, that's a very, very, very quick way of getting a highly accurate mask all the way around a landscape scene where you couldn't possibly have used a glass filter to do it. This is quite a long one, because we've gone in depth into all the other methods of doing it, but hopefully the Luma Range makes sense. If anyone's got any questions, then feel free to put them in the comments. Otherwise, check out some of the other videos and we'll cover some of the other Luma Range options for different genres over time.